Have you ever wondered what it would feel like to lose 5 children in a single night and never find a trace of them again? On Christmas Eve, 1945, the Sodder family home in West Virginia erupted in flames. When the smoke finally cleared, 5 of the 10 Sodder children had vanished, gone without a single explanation. And here's the part that will make your blood run cold. No bones, no teeth, no remains of any kind were ever found in the ashes. For nearly 8 decades, this case has baffled investigators, spawned countless theories, and left a family in a desperate, relentless search for answers that may never come. Tonight, we're diving deep into one of America's most haunting, unsolved mysteries. You'll see the evidence that doesn't add up, hear about strange phone calls and mysterious visitors in the days leading up to the fire, and uncover shocking details that suggest this was far more than a tragic accident. By the end of this video, you'll understand why the FBI maintained a file on this case for decades and why some people believe the Sodder children might have survived, living completely different lives under different names. But first, let me set the scene. Picture a large Italian-American family, living what seemed like the perfect American dream, nestled in the hills of West Virginia. George Sodder had immigrated from Italy in 1908, working tirelessly from nothing to become a successful businessman. He met Jenny, also from Italy, and together they built a life that, at first glance, seemed flawless. They had 10 children, a thriving trucking business, and a comfortable 2-story home in the small town of Fayetteville. Everything a family could hope for. But, as we'll soon see, appearances can be deceiving. George wasn't afraid to speak his mind, especially when it came to politics. He openly criticized Mussolini and Italy's involvement in World War II, a stance that didn't sit well with everyone in the community. Some neighbors whispered that his bold opinions had made him enemies, yet George never wavered in his beliefs. This seemingly small detail would later prove crucial in understanding the events that would unfold on that fateful night. In the months leading up to Christmas 1945, strange and unsettling occurrences began around the Sodder property. Mysterious phone calls came at odd hours, with no one on the other end, leaving an eerie sense of being watched. George's truck, an essential tool for his livelihood, had been sabotaged multiple times. Brake lines cut, sugar poured into the gas tank. A life insurance salesman had visited their home and issued veiled, chilling threats about how easily the house could burn down. When George refused to buy a policy, the man allegedly warned that the house would go up in smoke and the children would be destroyed. Even the local utility company seemed suspicious. Workers performing maintenance on nearby power lines were taking far longer than necessary, and George noticed their excessive attention to his property. When he asked questions, they responded with evasive answers and hastily finished their work, leaving a lingering sense of unease. Then came Christmas Eve, 1945. The night began like any other holiday evening. The family celebrated together, exchanging presents and enjoying one another's company. 9 of the 10 children were home. The eldest son, Joe, was away serving in the military. By bedtime, everything appeared calm and ordinary. Jenny and George settled into their first-floor bedroom, while the 9 children dispersed to their rooms, blissfully unaware that their lives were about to be shattered. Around 1:30 in the morning, Jenny was jolted awake by a strange, unsettling phone call. A woman's voice asked for someone who didn't live at their address. In the background, Jenny could hear laughter, faint music, and the clinking of glasses, as if the caller were at a party, or perhaps somewhere far more sinister. Jenny hung up, but unease lingered in the air. Then she noticed something odd. The lights downstairs were still on, and the front door was unlocked. An unusual oversight for a family that was normally so careful. She quickly turned off the lights, locked the door, and returned to bed. Yet a creeping sense of dread had settled over her. Something felt very wrong. About 30 minutes later, a loud crash erupted on the roof, followed by the unmistakable sound of something rolling across the shingles and thudding to the ground. Before she could investigate, a foul, choking smell of smoke reached her nostrils. She rushed to the window and was met with a horrifying sight. Flames devouring the lower level of their home, spreading with a terrifying speed. What happened next is where this story takes its first truly disturbing turn. George sprang into action, desperate to save his family, but the stairs to the second floor were already engulfed in flames. 5 of the children, Maurice, Martha, Louis, Jenny, and Betty, ranging in ages from 5 to 14, were trapped upstairs. George tried everything he could think of, climbing to the second floor windows, searching for an escape route. But the ladder that was always propped against the house was mysteriously missing. In desperation, George ran to move the family trucks closer, hoping to find another way. But the fire was already spreading too fast, trapping the children and engulfing the home in a raging inferno. Picture this. Christmas Eve, 1945. A family of 10 sleeps peacefully in their West Virginia home. Suddenly, flames erupt in the middle of the night. 5 family members escape. 5 children vanish forever. And here's what will make your blood run cold. Their bodies were never found in the ashes, and the evidence suggests this was no ordinary accident. Welcome to one of America's most haunting unsolved mysteries, the case of the Sodder children. I'm about to take you down a rabbit hole so dark and disturbing that it has kept investigators, amateur sleuths, and entire families awake for nearly 8 decades. What you're about to hear will challenge everything you think you know about house fires, family tragedies, and the extreme lengths some people will go to hide the truth. The Sodder family seemed like the American dream personified. George Sodder had immigrated from Italy in 1908, starting with nothing and working tirelessly to become a successful coal truck driver and entrepreneur in Fayetteville, West Virginia. He married Jenny Cipriani, also an Italian immigrant, and together they built a life that many could only dream of. By 1945, they had 10 children and owned a thriving trucking business, living in what appeared to be a picture-perfect family home. But beneath the surface, George had made enemies. He wasn't just a businessman. He was an outspoken critic of Mussolini's fascist regime in Italy. At a time when World War II was raging and tensions ran high, George's anti-fascist views didn't sit well with everyone in the small Appalachian community. He received threatening phone calls, and some people warned him to keep silent. But George refused to be silenced. This is where the story takes its first dark, unnerving turn, because what happened next wasn't just a tragedy. It was a calculated attack that would haunt the Sodder family for generations. It was December 24th, 1945, Christmas Eve, a night that should have been magical for the Sodder children. 10-year-old Betty, 9-year-old Jenny, 8-year-old Martha, 6-year-old Louis, and 5-year-old Maurice were likely dreaming of presents and holiday festivities. Their older siblings had grown up and moved out, but these 5 youngest children were the heart of the household, the center of the family's joy and laughter. The evening had begun normally. The family spent time together, some children playing with toys they'd received early. Jenny noticed that the lights were still on and the curtains drawn open when she went to bed around 11 p.m. But George reassured her that he would take care of it. This seemingly small, ordinary detail would later prove crucial in understanding what really happened that night. Around 1 a.m. on December 25th, Jenny was awakened by the ringing of the phone. She answered and heard a woman's voice asking for someone she didn't know. In the background, there was laughter and the faint clinking of glasses, as if the caller were at a party, or somewhere far more sinister. The woman hung up abruptly. Jenny returned to bed, but something felt profoundly wrong. At 1:30 a.m., she awoke again. This time, a loud bang shook the roof, followed by the sound of something rolling across the shingles and hitting the ground. She listened intently, heart pounding, but heard nothing more. Again, she tried to return to sleep, though unease clung to her. Then, at 2 a.m., everything changed forever. Jenny woke to the acrid smell of smoke. She jumped from bed and saw a horrifying sight. The house was on fire. Flames engulfed every corner, spreading faster than any ordinary blaze, leaving the family with mere minutes to escape. Panic gripped their hearts as George and Jenny scrambled to save what they could. But the night would soon become the most terrifying in their lives. George and Jenny managed to wake 4 of their children who were sleeping upstairs, their hearts racing as chaos and smoke filled the house. Marion, 17 years old, had already grown more independent, but even she was shaken to her core by the sudden roaring inferno. Have you ever wondered what it would truly feel like to lose 5 children in a single night, knowing you might never find them again, and spend the rest of your life searching for answers that may never come? On Christmas Eve 1945, the Sodder family home in West Virginia erupted in flames. When the smoke cleared, 5 children had vanished without a trace. Here's the part that chills the soul. No bodies were ever found. The fire burned suspiciously fast, and strange events had been occurring around the family for months leading up to that night. What I'm about to tell you will make you question everything you think you know about missing persons cases. This isn't just a story about a house fire. It's about a family that refused to give up, a mystery that spans decades, and evidence so disturbing it suggests these children might have been taken alive. George and Jenny Sodder had built what seemed like the perfect American dream in Fayetteville, West Virginia. George, an Italian immigrant who had worked his way up from nothing, owned a successful trucking business and had constructed a comfortable 2-story home for his growing family. By 1945, they had 10 children, ranging from toddlers to young adults. The older children had moved out or were serving in the military, but 9 still lived at home with their parents, unaware of the imminent horror that would soon strike. But beneath this picture of domestic bliss, something sinister was brewing. George had made enemies. In the months leading up to Christmas Eve 1945, these enemies made their presence known in increasingly threatening ways. George was outspoken against Mussolini and fascism, often criticizing the Italian dictator in public forums. This didn't sit well with some members of the local Italian-American community who supported the fascist regime. Tensions escalated, with several confrontations and heated arguments throughout 1945, leaving a shadow of danger hanging over the family. The first warning sign came from a life insurance salesman who visited the Sodder home earlier that year. This wasn't your ordinary insurance pitch. The man made it clear that George's house would go up in smoke and that his children would be destroyed because of George's anti-Mussolini stance. When George refused the policy and told the man to leave, the salesman made a chilling prediction, one that would prove prophetically accurate. He said George's house would burn down and his children would disappear. Then came the phone calls. Strange, unsettling voices would call at odd hours, speaking in broken English or Italian, hinting at vague, chilling threats about what might happen to the family. Jenny would answer, hear only whispers and cryptic tones, and immediately hang up. But the calls kept coming, growing more frequent and unnerving as Christmas approached. A sense of being watched settled over the household, and neighbors reported seeing unfamiliar cars parked near the Sodder home at night, their headlights cutting through the dark like silent warnings. Just a week before Christmas, George discovered that several of his coal trucks had been vandalized. Someone had cut the brake lines and tampered with the engines, causing serious damage to his business. When he reported these acts to the local police, they showed little interest, dismissing what George was certain were deliberate threats and sabotage, tied to the ominous phone calls he had been receiving. Christmas Eve, 1945, began like any other holiday evening for the Sodders. The family celebrated together, exchanging gifts and enjoying each other's company. The older children still at home, Marion, 17, Sylvia, 14, and John, 23, recently returned from military service, were there, watching over the younger ones. The five youngest, Maurice, Martha, Louis, Jenny, and Betty, were filled with excitement, preparing for the magic of Christmas morning. As the night wound down, Jenny put the younger children to bed while George did a final check, securing the house and glancing at the presents under the tree one last time. John had decided to visit friends in town and would return late. Marion and Sylvia were in their shared bedroom, and George and Jenny finally settled into their first-floor bedroom. Everything seemed calm, normal, even peaceful, as the family drifted off to sleep. But around 1 a.m., Jenny was awakened by a sound that would haunt her for the rest of her life. Something heavy had hit the roof, followed by a rolling thud, as if an object had been thrown onto the house and rolled across the shingles. She lay in bed, straining to listen, but the night remained silent. Thinking it might have been a large branch or a nocturnal animal, she eventually returned to bed, though unease had already settled into her chest. About 30 minutes later, the phone rang again. This wasn't unusual. George's trucking business sometimes required late-night calls, but what Jenny heard made her blood run cold. A woman's voice asked for someone who didn't live there. Behind the voice was the faint sound of laughter and clinking glasses, as though the call had come from a party or a distant bar. Jenny explained the mistake, but the caller hung up abruptly, offering neither apology nor explanation. Just after 2 a.m., Jenny awoke once more, this time to the acrid, choking smell of smoke. At first, she thought it was the fireplace, but as she became fully alert, she realized the smell was far too strong and emanated from somewhere else in the house. She shook George awake, and together they followed the scent to investigate, hearts pounding in terror. What they discovered defied all logic and understanding. George's office, a room separate from where the family slept, was engulfed in flames. But this was no ordinary fire. The flames burned with unnatural intensity, spreading faster than wood and paper should allow, almost as if some accelerant had been poured, fueling a blaze that moved with a deliberate, terrifying speed. George immediately tried to call the fire department, but when he picked up the phone, there was no dial tone. The line had been cut, though whether this was done before or during the fire would become a point of intense speculation for decades. Desperate, he ran to start his trucks to drive for help, only to discover that both vehicles had been sabotaged. Someone had removed the distributor caps and cut the electrical connections, leaving the trucks completely inoperable. With no way to call for help or drive to safety, George sent Marion and Sylvia running to neighbors' homes to summon the fire department, while he and Jenny focused on rescuing their family from the burning house. They managed to wake and evacuate John, who had returned home late and was sleeping in a downstairs room. But when they tried to reach the upstairs bedrooms, where Maurice, Martha, Louis, Jenny, and Betty were sleeping, they found their path blocked by flames and thick, choking smoke. George made multiple desperate attempts to reach the second floor, but the staircase was already engulfed in roaring fire. He searched for the ladder in the shed, only to find it missing, a ladder that had been there just days before. In a final act of desperation, he considered climbing one of the trucks to reach the second-story windows, but the sabotaged trucks wouldn't start. The fire was spreading at a terrifying speed, consuming the entire second floor within minutes. Neighbors, alerted by Marion and Sylvia, began arriving to help, but by then it was too late. The flames were so intense that no one could approach the house safely. The heat radiated outward with a ferocity unlike any normal house fire, leaving the impression that some kind of accelerant had fueled the blaze. What happened next would fuel decades of questions, suspicion, and conspiracy theories. Despite being called immediately, the volunteer fire department didn't arrive until 8 in the morning, nearly 6 hours after the fire began. By the time they arrived, the house had been completely reduced to rubble, leaving only the foundation and basement. The fire chief later claimed they had received the call much later than the family insisted, but multiple neighbors confirmed the fire department had been notified well before 3 a.m. When investigators finally began sifting through the ashes and debris, they made a discovery that would forever change the way this case was viewed. Despite the intense heat of the fire and the complete destruction of the second floor, where the 5 youngest children had been sleeping, not a single human remain was found. No bones, no teeth, no fragments of any kind. Nothing that should have remained after a fire of that magnitude. This absence was immediately suspicious to anyone familiar with how fires behave. Even in the most severe house fires, human bones and teeth typically survive in some form, often revealing dental work, fragments, or recognizable ash patterns that indicate where bodies had been. But in this case, nothing suggested the children had died in the flames. The official investigation was cursory at best and deeply flawed, raising serious questions about whether local authorities even wanted this case solved. The fire chief conducted a superficial examination of the debris, spending less than 2 hours on site before declaring that the children had died and that their remains had been completely consumed. This conclusion was made despite the absence of any physical evidence, contradicting well-established forensic knowledge about house fires. No autopsies were performed, no forensic specialists were consulted, and no systematic search of the debris was undertaken. Within days, the investigation was essentially closed, with authorities labeling the deaths accidental and attributing the lack of remains to the intensity of the fire. When George and Jenny demanded a more thorough inquiry, they were told to accept the official findings. But the Sodders were not willing to accept such explanations, especially considering the strange and threatening events that had preceded the fire. Determined to find the truth, George hired a private investigator and began conducting his own search for answers. What he uncovered over the following months would only deepen the mystery, reinforcing his belief that the children had not died in the fire, but had been kidnapped, vanished into the shadows by someone with chilling intent. The private investigator soon began uncovering evidence that local authorities had either overlooked or chosen to ignore. The first shocking discovery was that the phone lines to the Sodder house had been cut before the fire ever started, a detail that pointed not to an accident, but to premeditation. Someone had wanted to make sure no one could call for help. Then came another disturbing revelation. The missing ladder, the very ladder George had desperately searched for while his children were trapped upstairs, was eventually found lying in a ditch nearly a mile away from the house. It had not simply been misplaced. It had been removed and hidden deliberately to prevent any possible rescue. But perhaps the most important breakthrough came when the investigator arranged for the ashes and debris to be examined by independent fire experts. These specialists, men who had spent their lives studying the aftermath of fires, reached a conclusion that sent a chill through everyone involved. The blaze had burned far too fast and far too hot to be accidental. And more disturbingly, they stated that the complete absence of human remains was virtually impossible if 5 children had truly perished in that fire. They believed that some kind of accelerant had been used, not only to make the fire spread unnaturally fast, but possibly to destroy evidence and create the illusion of a fatal house fire, without actually burning human bodies to nothing. In other words, the fire looked less like an accident and more like a carefully staged crime scene. As word of the case began to spread, witnesses started coming forward, and what they described painted a picture not of a tragedy, but of a planned kidnapping. A bus driver who regularly passed the Sodder home told investigators that he had seen several unfamiliar cars parked near the property in the weeks leading up to Christmas Eve. Even more chilling, on the night of the fire, he claimed he saw those same cars speeding away from the area around the time the flames first appeared. Then a local businessman came forward with another unsettling story. He reported that strangers had approached him weeks earlier, asking detailed questions about the Sodder family's daily routines. They wanted to know when the children came home from school, when George left for work, and other information that would be extremely useful to someone planning an abduction. At the time, he thought the questions were merely strange. Only after the fire did he realize how sinister they truly were. But the most haunting claims of all came from people who said they had seen the missing children alive after the fire. One woman, who ran a restaurant about 50 miles from Fayetteville, contacted the Sodder family with a chilling story. She said that on Christmas morning, less than 12 hours after the fire, she had served breakfast to 5 children who matched the descriptions of the missing Sodder kids. According to her, the children looked frightened. They were accompanied by adults who watched them closely and did not allow them to speak to anyone. The woman said something about the scene felt deeply wrong, but by the time she realized who the children might have been, they were already gone. Another witness, a toll booth operator, reported something chilling. He had seen a car with out-of-state license plates, carrying several children who closely resembled the missing Sodder kids. What caught his attention was that the children appeared distressed, and one of them even tried to get his attention. But the adults in the car quickly drove away, seemingly aware that the child had noticed them. These sightings didn't stop there. For months after the fire, witnesses from multiple states reported encounters with children who matched the descriptions of Maurice, Martha, Louis, Jenny, and Betty. While some reports may have been mistaken identity, the consistency of the children's appearance, behavior, and the strict control of the adults accompanying them suggested that at least some sightings could have been genuine. George and Jenny Sodder refused to give up hope that their children were still alive. Determined to keep the search alive, they erected a billboard along Route 16, featuring photographs of the missing children and offering a reward for any information about their whereabouts. The billboard stood for decades, becoming a local landmark and keeping the case in the public eye long after most had forgotten about the tragic Christmas Eve fire. Over the years, the family received hundreds of tips and leads. Most proved to be false alarms or cases of mistaken identity, but some were strikingly tantalizing suggesting their children might indeed be alive. Anonymous letters would arrive periodically, some claiming knowledge of where the children were being held, others threatening the family if they did not stop searching. One of the most haunting pieces of correspondence came in the 1960s. A letter included a photograph of a young man who bore a striking resemblance to Louis Sodder, who would have been in his 20s by that time. The photo showed an urban setting, and on the back were the words, "Louis Sodder, I love Brother Frankie, a 90132 or 35. The family was convinced this was their missing son, though they were never able to trace the source of the photograph or verify its authenticity. It remained yet another mysterious piece in a puzzle that would haunt the Sodders and America for decades. Another chilling development came in 1968. A woman contacted the Sodders, claiming to be connected to a crime family and asserting that she knew what had happened to the children. She arranged a meeting with George, giving the family a glimmer of hope, but she never showed up. Hours later, news reached them that the woman had been found dead in her hotel room under suspicious circumstances, mere hours before the scheduled appointment. The timing was too precise to be coincidental, and it sent a wave of fear through the family. Whoever was behind this case was still watching, still controlling the story from the shadows. The mystery took yet another strange turn in the 1970s, when human remains were discovered in the basement area of the former Sodder home. Local authorities initially suggested that these might belong to the missing children, a tantalizing hope for the grieving family. But forensic analysis shattered that possibility. The bones were determined to be from much older individuals, placed there long after the fire. Someone, it seemed, had deliberately tried to mislead investigators or plant false evidence, keeping the mystery alive and the Sodders in torment. Through all of these developments, George and Jenny Sodder never wavered in their belief. Their children had been kidnapped, most likely as revenge for George's political views and outspoken business dealings. They suspected that members of the local Italian-American community who supported fascism had orchestrated the abduction, punishing George for his bold criticism of Mussolini. While this theory could never be conclusively proven, it aligned eerily with the threats, sabotage, and suspicious circumstances surrounding the fire, a dark puzzle that refused to be solved. The psychological toll on the Sodder family was immense. Jenny never recovered from the trauma of that fateful Christmas Eve and the decades of uncertainty that followed. She spent her life clinging to hope for news of her children, while simultaneously grieving for what she had lost, a sorrow that never faded. George threw himself into the search, spending thousands of dollars on private investigators and following leads across multiple states. Yet he never found the definitive answers he desperately sought. The surviving Sodder children were also haunted. Marion and Sylvia, who had survived the fire, carried survivor's guilt and the constant reminder of their missing siblings. John, who had been away that night and returned to a destroyed home and shattered family, became obsessed with finding his younger siblings, dedicating years to pursuing every lead, tip, and theory. Modern forensic experts reviewing the case continue to find the official conclusions highly questionable. The absence of human remains in a house fire is extremely rare, typically suggesting that the victims were not present when the fire occurred. The blaze's rapid spread and extreme intensity, coupled with the sabotage of vehicles and phone lines, points toward criminal activity rather than accident. Some investigators theorize that the fire was a calculated cover-up, set after the children had already been removed from the house. This would explain why no remains were found, and why the fire burned so unusually hot and fast. The perpetrators may have used the fire to destroy evidence of the kidnapping, creating the impression that the children had died and reducing the likelihood of authorities searching for them as living victims. The organized nature of the crime, advanced threats, deliberate sabotage, precise timing, and flawless execution, suggests the involvement of multiple perpetrators with careful planning and significant resources. This was not a spontaneous act of violence. It was a meticulously orchestrated operation, requiring knowledge of the family's routines and the ability to coordinate multiple criminal actions simultaneously. A dark and chilling testament to how far someone would go to silence the Sodders and their children. What makes this case particularly haunting is the terrifying possibility that if the children were indeed kidnapped rather than killed, some, or even all, might have lived long enough to grow up, marry, and start families of their own. Imagine the nightmare. Children taken from their home, stripped of their names and identities, forced to live lives they never chose, perhaps carrying faint, fragmented memories of their parents and siblings. The 5 children ranged from 5 to 14 years old enough to remember the love of their family, but young enough to be manipulated, coerced, or brainwashed into accepting new identities. The Sodder case has become one of America's most enduring unsolved mysteries, sparking countless theories, investigations, and media attention over the decades. It is more than just a story of missing children. It is a story about the limits of official investigations, the relentless power of a family's determination, and the chilling realization that sometimes the truth is far more complex and disturbing than any official explanation. Even today, over 75 years after that fateful Christmas Eve, the fate of Maurice, Martha, Louis, Jenny, and Betty Sodder remains unknown. The youngest surviving members of the Sodder family continue to hope for answers, though most of the people directly involved in the case have passed away. Modern DNA testing and advanced investigative techniques offer new possibilities, yet they are limited by the harsh reality that critical evidence may no longer exist, and witnesses who could tell the truth may no longer be alive. This is not just a story of a fire. It's a story of calculated cruelty, lingering mysteries, and the unbreakable bond of a family that refuses to give up, no matter how much the world tells them they should. The Sodder children, if they survived, would now be elderly individuals, living lives they may have never imagined. They might have families of their own, jobs and routines, but perhaps they do not even know they were kidnapped. Raised under different identities, told fabricated stories about their origins, they may have carried the weight of a truth they could not speak aloud. Or perhaps some always knew the truth, yet fear or circumstance kept them silent, locked away from the family that loved them. What remains is a mystery that defies logic, one that challenges our assumptions about how crimes are solved and how justice is served. The Sodder case shows that sometimes the official answer isn't the correct answer, and that families who refuse to accept inadequate explanations can uncover truths that might otherwise remain hidden forever. Whether the 5 missing children are alive or dead, their story reminds us that behind every unsolved case are real people, real lives, irrevocably changed by events that may never be fully understood. The legacy of the Sodder children endures, not only in the ongoing enigma of their disappearance, but in the example set by their parents, George and Jenny, who never gave up hope and never accepted answers that didn't make sense. Their unwavering determination has continued to inspire new investigations, renewed interest in cold cases, and hope for justice. Some mysteries are too important to forget, no matter how many decades pass without resolution.